Everyone knows Kursk. The summer of 1943, the largest tank battle in history, the moment the German army threw its best armoured formations against the deepest prepared defences the Soviet Union had ever built and broke on them like a wave on rock. Prokhorovka, the Tiger tanks, the burning fields, the SS Panzer Corps driving into a wall of Soviet steel and being stopped for the first time in a major offensive engagement, the moment historians point to when they say the war in the East was decided. Everyone knows Kursk. It has been written about in 100 books, documented in archives in Moscow and Berlin and Washington, recreated in film and television and war game and painting. Everyone knows the scale. More than 3 million men, 6,000 tanks, 4,000 aircraft, on a front 600 kilometers wide. Everyone knows the outcome. Kursk is the famous one. It is the battle that defined how the world understands the Eastern Front. What almost nobody talks about is what happened 20 months later, in conditions that were in some respects worse than Kursk, with stakes that were, if anything, more desperate, in a battle that the men fighting it understood, from the first day, to be something they could not win. In March 1945, with the Red Army standing 70 kilometers from Berlin, with the Third Reich in its final weeks of existence, with every professional soldier in the German High Command, understanding that the war was over and had been over for months, Adolf Hitler assembled the last intact armoured force remaining to him, the finest formations the Waffen-SS had ever fielded, and sent them into battle in Hungary. Not to defend Berlin, not to shorten the front and buy weeks, not for any strategic purpose that would have been recognised as coherent by any military professional in any army in the world. He sent them into Hungary because of oil. Because a cluster of oil fields in a corner of a country that had been Germany's ally, and was rapidly ceasing to be mattered to him in a way that nothing else did. And what followed was, in its own way, worse than Kursk. The men who attacked knew it was a death ride before they moved. The ground itself became an enemy as lethal as the Soviets. The defensive preparation waiting for them was built on everything the Red Army had learned at Kursk and Kharkov and 100 engagements between. And at the end of 10 days of fighting that cost casualties on a scale nobody outside specialist circles has ever properly reckoned, the greatest tank army the SS ever put into the field was shattered in a Hungarian swamp, its vehicles sinking into the mud, its men retreating under the specific humiliation of having their commander told by Hitler that they had not fought as the situation demanded. This is the Battle of Lake Balaton, Operation Spring Awakening, the last major German offensive of the Second World War, and it deserves to be understood as what it actually was, and one of the most brutal, most desperate and most futile battles of the entire Eastern Front. A battle that has been forgotten, not because it was small, but because the outcome was so clear from the beginning that the history books treat it almost as an afterthought to a war that was already decided. It was not an afterthought to the men who fought it, it was the last place they were asked to give everything they had, in the full knowledge that everything they had would not be enough for a cause that the man asking had already condemned to failure by the decisions he had made. To understand why it happened, you need to understand what oil meant in March 1945. Not oil as an abstraction, not oil as a line on a balance sheet, but oil as the literal fuel that kept every German tank moving, every German aircraft flying, every German vehicle on every road, in every theatre of the war in motion. Allied strategic bombing had been destroying Germany's synthetic oil production facilities since mid-1944. The Leuna works, the Perlitz refinery, the Hydrierwerk, Scholven, the enormous industrial complexes that converted coal into synthetic fuel had been hit again and again, and by early 1945, they were operating at a fraction of their capacity on the best days and not at all on the worst. The German war machine was running on fumes, literally. There were Panther tanks sitting in depots in Germany in early 1945 that could not be moved to the front because there was no fuel to put in them. There were aircraft that could not fly. There were divisions that could not maneuver because their trucks had empty tanks. The one significant natural oil source that remained in German-controlled territory was in southern Hungary, the Nagykanizsa oil region, a cluster of producing fields and refineries that had been supplying more than 3/4 of the petroleum still reaching the German war machine by early 1945. Los Nagykanizsa and the German ability to continue fighting in any conventional military sense effectively ended. It was not a matter of months, it was a matter of weeks. Hitler understood this with a clarity he applied to almost nothing else in the war's final phase. While his generals were arguing that the immediate priority was defending the Oder River line east of Berlin, the last geographical barrier between the Soviet front and the German capital, Hitler was insisting that Hungary mattered more than Berlin. He said it explicitly. He is on record as accepting the risk of Berlin falling in order to protect the Hungarian oil area. He genuinely believed that if he could hold Nagykanizsa, the fuel it produced would keep the German military operational long enough for something to change, for the Anglo-American alliance to fracture, for the new weapons to arrive, for the trajectory of the war to reverse. Heinz Guderian, the German army's chief of staff, knew this was fantasy. He wanted the 6th SS Panzer Army deployed behind the Oder to defend Berlin. He argued for it at conference after conference through January 1945. Hitler listened, dismissed the argument, and told him, with the specific contempt that characterized his dealings with the professional military by this stage of the war, "You intend on operating without gasoline? Fine. The 6th Panzer Army is off to Budapest." The matter was closed. What was the 6th SS Panzer Army? It was the most powerful armoured formation the Waffen-SS had ever assembled, and it was being sent to Hungary. Under the command of SS Oberstgruppenführer Josef Dietrich, Sepp Dietrich, the Bavarian butcher's apprentice who had become Hitler's personal bodyguard in the 1920s and risen through every major campaign of the war to command an army. It contained 4 of the most formidable armoured divisions in the German order of battle. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Hitler's own bodyguard formation, the division that bore his name on a cuff title worn on the left sleeve of every man in the division, the formation that had been first into battle in every German offensive since Poland, that had won Kharkov, that had been the spearhead at the Bulge. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, the division built from the Hitler Youth, whose members had been barely 17 when they first fought at Normandy, and who had fought with a ferocity that appalled even experienced Allied commanders. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, and in a separate corps, the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf, and the 5th SS Panzer Division Viking. These were not fresh formations, they had been ground down by 4 years of continuous fighting. The Leibstandarte that had entered the Soviet Union in June 1941 with 11,000 men, and arrived at Lake Balaton in February 1945 was a formation of veterans who had survived things that should have killed them, led by officers who had been fighting the same war since the beginning and who understood exactly what the situation was. They had just come from the Ardennes offensive and the Battle of the Bulge, where they had been the spearhead of Hitler's last offensive in the West and had failed to break through. They had been pulled out of that failure, given a few weeks to refit with replacements and new equipment, and immediately loaded onto trains heading east. They arrived in Hungary in February 1945, and they were told they were going to attack. Sepp Dietrich did not believe the attack would succeed. He said so. His chief of staff and his operations officer said so in terms that were not ambiguous. They had looked at the terrain between Lake Balaton and Lake Velence, the 2 bodies of water whose shores would channel the advance, and they had understood immediately that it was wrong for armour. Only 2 roads in the entire attack zone were paved. The rest were farm tracks that barely qualified as roads under normal conditions, and which an early spring thaw was rapidly converting into something worse. The drainage ditches and irrigation canals that networked the agricultural plain would cut across every axis of advance. The ground itself, saturated with snowmelt and winter rain, was beginning to lose its structural integrity. Tracked vehicles that should have been able to move cross-country were instead finding that the earth gave way beneath them. In late February, Dietrich's operations officer drove through the assembly area and sent back a report that should have stopped the offensive cold. In the constricted area between Lakes Balaton and Velence, the mud became alarming. The closer one came to the assembly area, the more widespread the land that was underwater. Impassable for all kinds of vehicles, a panzer attack in open terrain under these conditions is out of the question. Dietrich himself went to Guderian and asked him to support a request to postpone the attack by at least 2 days, hoping the ground might firm up. Guderian tried. The answer from Hitler was no. The attack was scheduled for March 6, 1945, and it would go ahead on March 6, 1945, regardless of what the ground was doing. The panzer crews were told to prepare their vehicles. The panzer grenadiers were moved into their starting positions. The artillery registered its targets. And, in the early hours of March 6th, the last great German offensive of the Second World War began. On the other side of the line, Marshal Fyodor Tolbukin had known it was coming for 3 weeks. Soviet intelligence had identified the German armoured concentrations in western Hungary in mid-February. Hungarian deserters had confirmed that a major offensive was being prepared. Tolbukin did not know the exact date, but he knew the direction, he knew the approximate scale, and he had 6 weeks to prepare for it. He used every hour. What he built between the two lakes, and extending for 30 kilometers into the Soviet rear, was the most comprehensive anti-tank defensive system constructed since Kursk, which was exactly the model he was working from. Tolbukin's engineers worked through February and into the first days of March constructing a defence that used the ground itself as a weapon. 66 anti-tank killing zones over 83 kilometres of front. Each zone contained between 12 and 24 guns, many of them 122mm and 152mm pieces capable of destroying any German tank at any range at which a tank could engage them first. 65% of all available Soviet artillery was massed into these zones. In the sectors Tolbukin judged most threatened, the narrow corridor between Lake Balaton and Lake Valence through which the German main effort would have to pass, the gun density reached 60 to 70 artillery pieces per kilometre of front. There were sectors of the Soviet line in the Balaton corridor where a German tank that broke through the forward positions would find another anti-tank gun every 16 metres for 30 kilometres in every direction it tried to advance. He built a pipeline under the Danube River to guarantee fuel supply to his forces regardless of what happened to the ferry crossings. He built additional road bridges. He positioned his armoured reserves not for offensive action, but as mobile pillboxes. Tanks dug into hull-down positions from which they could engage German armour while presenting minimal target profile. Soviet tank crews dug revetments by hand, and with whatever engineer equipment was available, created firing positions that allowed them to observe and shoot while exposing only the gun mantellate, and registered their weapons against every approach route in their sector. A German tank commander driving toward a hull-down Soviet T-34/85 was looking at a problem with the dimensions of a gun sight and the firepower of a medium tank and the structural protection of a prepared fortification. The experience the Red Army had gained since Kursk, 2 years of fighting the most capable armoured force in the world, was concentrated into a defensive belt specifically designed to destroy what was coming. Tolbukin had one plan: let the Germans in, let them bleed against the depth of the defence, let them exhaust their strength and their fuel, and their men against a position that bent but did not break. Feed reserves in to seal each penetration before it could be exploited. And then, when they were spent, when the 6th SS Panzer Army had driven itself into the ground, the way he calculated it would, launch his own offensive toward Vienna that had already been planned for March 15th. The German offensive would not change his timeline. It would simply determine how many Germans would be left when his own attack began. At 4 o'clock in the morning on March 6, 1945, the guns of the 6th SS Panzer Army opened a 30-minute barrage against the Soviet positions. In the darkness and the mud, the Panzer Grenadiers of the Leibstandarte moved forward. Their first mission was not to advance, it was to clear lanes through the Soviet minefields that protected the forward positions. This took all morning. By the time the mines had been cleared enough for the armour to move, the day was already partly gone, and the mud had already claimed the first vehicles. The Tigers and Panthers that pulled off the roads to manoeuvre around obstacles found the ground soft enough to slow them, and in the worst spots liquid enough to stop them. The tank commanders who radioed back to report they were bogged received the answer: push forward. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which was supposed to strike in coordination with the Leibstandarte, did not even reach its assembly area until darkness fell on March 6th. The roads were blocked by vehicles that had gotten stuck, by traffic jams that formed when the only passable route became the only route every vehicle in the Corps was trying to use simultaneously, by the accumulated friction of moving thousands of tons of steel across ground that was not designed to carry it. Das Reich and Hohenstaufen missed their opening moves entirely, allowing the Soviets time to bring additional forces into the threatened sector before the German assault arrived. By the end of the first day, the 6th SS Panzer Army had advanced 4 to 7 kilometers, not the decisive breakthrough that would tear the Soviet defense open, not the deep penetration that would force a withdrawal. 4 to 7 kilometers of mud, purchased with men and machines and fuel that could not be replaced. Army Group South's war diary recorded it without emotion. The attack had achieved initial penetration, but progress was slow due to terrain conditions. Sepp Dietrich had been right, and being right meant nothing. Lieutenant Eduard Melikov of the 877th Artillery Regiment of the Red Army was on the receiving end of those first waves. He survived the battle and left an account that has the quality of a man describing something he does not entirely believe he lived through. At Balaton, our regiment suffered colossal losses, he said. 200 German tanks all at once rolled towards our division. Our howitzers were firing point blank. The fighting was ferocious. In the entire war, the regiment didn't lose as many men as it did in Hungary. A man who had been through 4 years of the Eastern Front, including the worst of the fighting at Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, the long campaigns through Ukraine and Romania, and his clearest memory of the worst combat he endured was a field in Hungary in March 1945, when the German Panthers came in waves out of the mud and his guns fired until the barrels were hot enough to cook on. What Melikov was describing from the Soviet side was what made this battle specifically savage in a way that the strategic narrative does not convey. The German divisions attacking at Balaton were not the ghost formations that characterized so much of the Wehrmacht by 1945, paper divisions whose real strength was a fraction of their nominal establishment, formations that had been bled down to battalion-sized remnants and given divisional designations to pad the order of battle. The SS formations at Balaton were genuinely powerful. They had been refitted. They had Tiger II tanks, the König Tiger, the King Tiger, 68 tons of steel whose armour could resist Soviet anti-tank fire at most combat ranges, and whose 88mm gun could destroy any Soviet tank it could see. They had Panthers, they had Jagdpanthers, they had been given priority for fuel, for ammunition, for replacements. When Melikov says 200 tanks rolled toward his division, he means 200 tanks, not exaggeration, not rounding up. The German armoured commitment at Balaton was the largest concentration of armour the Eastern Front had seen since Kursk. On March 7th, rain mixed with light snow. The Germans attacked again. The mud was worse. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps finally got into the fight. Das Reich and Hohenstaufen drove a 6-kilometre wedge into the Soviet defences, but the Army Group South War Diary recorded the nature of this advance with a telling detail. They did it primarily with infantry forces, not armour. The armour was stuck. The Panzer Grenadiers, the motorised infantry who were supposed to ride their half-tracks into the gap created by the tanks, were walking. The mud had taken the half-tracks, and walking Panzer Grenadiers attacking prepared Soviet positions without armour support were taking casualties at a rate that the formations could not sustain. ISS Panzer Corps on the western side of the Savys Canal made more progress. By 8 o'clock in the evening on March 7th, Soviet records confirmed that the Leibstandarte had breached the second-line defences of the Soviet 68th Guards Division on a 5-kilometre front. The Guards Division pulled back. A gap had been torn in the Soviet line. Dietrich's men had done what they had been doing since 1941. They had found a weakness and driven through it. The question was whether there was anything behind them capable of exploiting the penetration before the Soviets sealed it. The answer was no, because the reserves were in the mud. By March 8th, the Hitlerjugend had pushed 16 kilometers forward and run headlong into the next element of Tolbukin's defense. A Soviet PAK front, anti-tank guns dug into ridgelines in prepared positions that had been registered before the battle began. The Hitlerjugend's panzers came up the slope and found Soviet guns waiting at the crests that they had not been able to see from the approach. The guns opened fire. The lead vehicles were hit. The follow-on vehicles tried to deploy and found that the ground on either side of the approach route would not support their weight. The attack stalled on the ridge under fire from positions that could not be flanked without bogging. It was on March 9th that the Soviets introduced what their historical accounts describe without special emphasis, but which German commanders recorded with something approaching shock: anti-aircraft artillery in direct fire mode against tanks. Soviet 85mm anti-aircraft guns, which had the ballistic performance and the caliber to penetrate the side and rear armour of German tanks at combat ranges, were repositioned from their air defence roles and placed in the path of the German advance. A Tiger II, whose frontal armour could turn German anti-tank rounds, found that an 85mm anti-aircraft round hitting the side or the engine deck told a different story. The German tank crews who encountered this for the first time reported it to their commanders, and their commanders reported it upward. The improvisation that Soviet commanders had developed over 4 years of fighting using every weapon at their disposal regardless of its intended role, had reached a level of sophistication that even the veteran SS formations had not fully encountered. The ground through March 9th and 10th was a specific kind of hell that the strategic accounts do not describe because strategy does not have the vocabulary for it. The landscape between the two lakes was a network of drainage features and canals, ditches, streams, irrigation channels that had been built over decades to manage water on Hungarian agricultural land, and that now, saturated by the thaw, were channeling every vehicle into the roads, and the roads into the few stone bridges, and the stone bridges into kill zones that Soviet gunners had registered before the battle began. A column of German armour moving toward the Danube was threading through a maze of water features, each crossing point a funnel that concentrated the formation into a target that Soviet guns did not need to aim at so much as point at. The German tactical advantage, superior crew training, superior fire control, the specific quality of veteran crews who could identify, range and engage Soviet targets faster than the Soviets could reciprocate, was neutralised by terrain that turned every approach into a shooting gallery where the defenders knew the range to every metre of the road. By March 10th, the progress west of the Savas Canal was being measured in hundreds of metres per day, rather than kilometres. The Leibstandarte was consolidating the ground it had taken, rather than pushing further. The exhaustion of men and vehicles that had been in continuous combat for 5 days was visible in the way attacks were organised. Smaller groups, shorter objectives, more pauses to reorganise. The Leibstandarte at Lake Balaton was not the Leibstandarte of Kharkov in 1943. It was what remained of that formation after everything that had happened in the 2 years between, and what remained was still fighting, but not the same way. The Sio Canal battle, which reached its peak on March 12th, was where the 2-week offensive showed its most specific brutality. The Sio Canal was 30 metres wide, running roughly east-west across the German axis of advance. It had to be crossed to reach the Danube and fulfill the operation's objective. Crossing a 30-metre canal under fire with armoured vehicles that needed bridge support to cross, while Soviet anti-tank guns covered every possible crossing site, was not a tactical problem that had a clean solution. The Hitlerjugend's crossing attempt was catastrophic. Fire support panzers and Jagdpanzers moved to the canal bank to suppress the Soviet positions on the far side, and were immediately engaged by anti-tank fire from pre-sighted positions. The armour was driven back from the bank before it could provide effective suppression. The Panzer Grenadiers, who were supposed to cross under that suppression, went anyway, in rubber assault craft paddling across 30 metres of open water while Soviet machine guns on the far bank worked back and forth across the surface. Most of the men who started the crossing reached the other side. Most of those who didn't were either dead or wounded before they were halfway across. The few who established a foothold on the south bank dug in and held, outnumbered, waiting for the bridge that was supposed to follow. Combat engineers built a tank bridge. A Jagdpanzer IV drove across it. A second vehicle started across. The bridge collapsed under the weight and dropped into the canal. The engineers began repairs. The bridgehead on the south bank held on without reinforcement as the engineers worked. They kept it repaired, kept vehicles crossing one at a time, held the bridgehead against Soviet counterattacks for 3 more days before the mathematics of the situation could not be argued with any further. In the Leibstandarte sector, the crossing went better. The division used a town with enough overhead cover to conceal its movement from Soviet observers, brought 88mm flak guns and King Tigers to the canal bank, and systematically destroyed the Soviet anti-tank positions that had been controlling the crossing sites. A proper bridge was built, vehicles crossed, reinforcements arrived. A bridgehead was established and held for 3 days against counterattacks that included a full regiment of T-34/85 tanks, held at a cost of men and ammunition that was drawing down reserves that had no prospect of replacement, held because the men in the Leibstandarte had been holding positions they had no business holding since the beginning of the war, and this was simply the latest version of the same problem. On the Soviet side of the canal, in the positions that the Leibstandarte's King Tigers and 88mm guns had been systematically destroying, men of the 43rd Destroyer Anti-Tank Artillery Brigade held until they could not hold any longer. 3 regiments of this brigade, guns manned by Soviet artillerymen who had been trained specifically to stop German armour, kept their positions when the infantry on both sides of them retreated under the pressure of the German advance. They did not retreat. They fired until the German tanks were close enough to see the faces of the commanders in the hatches. They destroyed 44 German tanks before losing 32 of their guns. The crews who lost their guns picked up rifles and continued the fight as infantry. This is the thing that both sides at Balaton share, and that gets lost in the strategic narrative. The men fighting this battle were not fighting recklessly or without understanding. The German Panzer grenadiers who paddled across the Sio in rubber boats knew what they were doing. The Soviet artillerymen who held their guns when the infantry left them knew what they were doing. The Tiger II commanders who drove their vehicles off the roads and felt the ground give under 68 tons of steel knew what they were doing. They were all professionals at the end of a very long war, doing what professionals do, their job, in conditions that made it nearly impossible, without illusions about what it was going to cost. By March 11th, the situation was clear to everyone except Hitler. Dietrich sent a direct request asking for a temporary halt to the offensive to allow the ground to firm up and the formations to consolidate. Hitler refused. On March 12th, the last armoured reserve available to Army Group South, 6 Panzer battalions consolidated into a battle group, was committed. 200 tanks and assault guns, the last cards in the hand. They attacked. They pushed into the Soviet position on the western bank of the Savis. They took ground. They were stopped. By mid-March, 40% of the German armoured vehicles that had started the offensive had been lost. Some had been destroyed by Soviet fire. More had broken down from the mechanical stress of operating in mud that packed into every component and wore out tracks and drive sprockets and running gear at a rate that pre-war engineering had not calculated for. And some, the most symbolic losses of the entire battle, had simply sunk. Sepp Dietrich wrote about it after the war with the flat affect of a man describing something he had watched and still not entirely processed. 15 Tiger II heavy tanks, the most powerful armoured vehicles in the German arsenal, sunk up to their turrets in Hungarian mud, not hit by Soviet guns, not disabled by mechanical failure, buried in the ground they were supposed to conquer. The tank commanders who watched this made a specific joke. They said they were operating submarines. They said they were steering U-boats through the Hungarian steppes. It is the kind of joke that men make when the alternative to laughing is something they cannot afford to do in the middle of a battle. On March 14th, Goebbels wrote in his diary that failure of the offensive was likely. The diary entry is notable for its matter-of-fact tone, not shock or despair, but the assessment of a man who had been rationalizing Hitler's decisions for 12 years and had run out of ways to do it for this particular one. On March 15th, the German advance stopped. The maximum penetration achieved by the 6th SS Panzer Army was 30 kilometers on the strongest axis. The Danube had not been reached. Budapest had not been retaken. The Nagykanizsa oilfields had not been definitively secured. 7 defensive belts, 25 to 30 kilometers of depth, 66 anti-tank killing zones. Tolbukin's defence had absorbed everything the SS had thrown at it and was still standing. Guderian wrote in his memoirs about what he observed in the aftermath. All chances for major success have evaporated. The hitherto high combat morale of the SS divisions was now lost. Under the cover of the stubbornly resistant tank crews, entire formations retreated against orders. It was no longer possible to rely on these divisions. This assessment, by a man who had opposed the offensive from the beginning, who had watched it fail in exactly the way he predicted it would fail, contains something that needs to be read carefully. He was not saying the men of the SS were cowards. He was saying the impossible had been demanded of them in impossible conditions, and they had given everything and it had not been enough, and now they were done. The high combat morale of the SS divisions was now lost. That sentence describes something specific, the specific exhaustion of formations that have been fighting for 4 years, and have just expended their last reserves of belief in what they were doing. On March 16th, Tolbukin's counterattack began. He had waited for exactly this, the moment when the German attack had consumed itself. More than 3,000 Soviet vehicles, including 600 tanks, drove north past Budapest and swept around both sides of Lake Balaton. The German formations that had been grinding forward for 10 days found Soviet armour coming at them from directions they had not been defending. The 4th SS Panzer Corps was caught in the storm. The Wiking Division, which had been fighting to hold its position in the German line, found its Hungarian allies on its flank dissolving under Soviet pressure. The Hungarian division simply stopped fighting, not retreating to prepared positions, not withdrawing in order, but ceasing to exist as a military unit in any practical sense within hours of the Soviet offensive beginning. Viking's commander SS Oberfuhrer Karl Ulrich received Hitler's order through the chain of command: hold at all costs. He looked at the situation, his division nearly surrounded, his flanks open, Soviet armour driving into his rear, and made the decision that any professional soldier makes when the order from above is suicidal and the alternative is losing the formation entirely. He ignored the order and pulled his men back before the encirclement closed. The Hohenstaufen division, seeing what was happening to Wiking, also pulled back, also without orders, also in explicit defiance of Hitler's directive. These were SS men who had been among the most fanatically obedient soldiers in the German military for the entire war, ignoring direct orders from Hitler to preserve their formations. The war had reached the point where even the SS would not die for nothing. The 1st SS Panzer Corps managed to extract itself from the trap, but left behind enormous quantities of equipment, not vehicles that had been destroyed in combat, vehicles that were abandoned, in working condition. The crews drove their tanks and armoured vehicles into the mud or ditched them beside the roads, and walked away because the formations were moving faster than the vehicles could go. The accounting done after the battle found that 185 German armoured vehicles, tanks, tank destroyers, self-propelled guns had been abandoned in working condition, 185 pieces of irreplaceable hardware left in Hungarian fields because there was no fuel to run them, no time to wait for recovery, and nothing waiting at the other end of the retreat that would have justified the attempt. The final total of German armoured vehicle losses across Spring Awakening and the immediate Soviet counteroffensive was 882. In 10 days, the 6th SS Panzer Army had lost its operational capability as a striking force. The formations that had led the Ardennes offensive 3 months earlier were finished as armoured divisions in any meaningful sense. Soviet records from the counteroffensive describe advancing through fields that looked like vehicle depots. Panthers with their engines still warm, pulled into drainage ditches and abandoned. Tiger IIs sitting on solid ground where the road had finally given the crews enough traction to drive them out of the mud. Abandoned because the fuel was gone and the crews were walking. Assault guns with their ammunition bins still loaded, guns still operational, left where they stood. Soviet collection teams photographed every abandoned vehicle and documented their condition. The photographs still exist in Russian archives. They show a steel graveyard stretching across the Hungarian plain. Not the burning wrecks of combat, but the cold, undamaged hulks of vehicles that had run out of everything except the ground to sit on. By March 20th, ISS Panzer Corps had 80 tanks, assault guns, and self-propelled guns left across all its formations. It had started the offensive with several hundred. The 6th SS Panzer Army as a whole had lost more than 250 armoured vehicles to all causes, combat, mechanical failure, abandonment, in 10 days of fighting. Soviet sources give a total of 882 armoured vehicles lost by the Germans in the battle and its immediate aftermath, 185 of which were abandoned intact. Then came the armband order, Hitler receiving reports of the SS formations retreating, of units pulling back against orders, of the offensive he had staked so much on collapsing, reached for the one instrument he had always used to punish perceived failure, symbolic humiliation. He instructed Himmler to personally deliver to Sepp Dietrich the order that the Waffen-SS units involved in the battle, the Leibstandarte, Das Reich, Totenkopf, Hohenstaufen, were to remove their honour cuff titles as a mark of disgrace. The cuff titles were the black bands worn on the lower left sleeve of every man in these formations. The Leibstandartes read Adolf Hitler, the Führer's own name, worn on the uniform of the men he had called his own. Hitler's charge. The troops did not fight, as the situation demanded. Himmler did not have the courage to face Dietrich in person. He sent the order by telegram. Dietrich's response has passed into history. He told SS Obersturmbannführer Meyer that the armbands would stay on. He did not pass the order to his men, and in a gesture that became legendary, whether it happened exactly as described or accumulated the character of legend around a documented act of defiance, he sent back to Berlin a chamber pot filled with medals. The reference is to a line from Goethe's play that translates, in the bluntest possible rendering, as a directive about where a man's enemies can put themselves. Whether the specific story is literal truth or the kind of embellishment that grows around moments of genuine defiance, the documented fact is this: Sepp Dietrich, whose entire career had been built on loyalty to Adolf Hitler, who had been Hitler's bodyguard before Hitler was anything other than a failed putsch leader in a Munich prison, who had fought in Hitler's name since the beginning and worn Hitler's name on his sleeve for years, looked at the order, told his men it would not be passed on, and effectively told Hitler where to put his disgrace. He gave his reasons publicly in the aftermath. His men had fought in mud that Hitler had been warned about, against defences that multiple senior commanders had told Hitler would be too strong to break, in terrain that the Hungarian military had specifically identified as unsuitable for armoured attack. The failure of Spring Awakening was not a failure of the men, it was the failure of the decision to launch it, and Dietrich was not going to put his name on a lie that said otherwise. By March 22nd, the surviving German forces had withdrawn to prepared positions that were almost immediately overrun. By March 30th, the Third Ukrainian Front had crossed from Hungary into Austria. By April 4th, the 6th SS Panzer Army was in the Vienna area, trying to hold a city that fell on April 13th. The road from the mud of Balaton to the ruins of Vienna took less than a month. By April 15th, what was left of the 6th SS Panzer Army, the Leibstandarte, Hitlerjugend, das Reich, Hohenstaufen, Totenkopf, Wiking, was north of Vienna facing Soviet forces on 3 sides and the Alps on the 4th. They would fight through April, retreating west, maintaining a coherent rearguard action that achieved nothing except staying alive long enough to reach the Americans. On May 8, 1945, Sepp Dietrich surrendered to American forces in the foothills of the Austrian Alps. The man who had led the Leibstandarte since its formation as a parade ground bodyguard in 1933, who had commanded an SS regiment in Poland, an SS division in France and the Balkans and Russia, an SS corps at Kharkov and Kursk and Normandy and the Bulge, and an SS army at Balaton, walked out of the war and into American captivity without the surrender ceremony he had attended so many times on the other side. He was convicted in 1946 of war crimes relating to the Malmedy massacre, where Leibstandarte troops had shot American prisoners of war during the Ardennes offensive. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, released in 1955. Convicted again in West Germany for his role in the 1934 Night of the Long Knives, sentenced to 18 months, released in 1958. He died in Ludwigsburg in 1966, aged 73. At his funeral, 4,000 former members of the Waffen-SS attended. Whatever verdict history has rendered on what he served and what was done in the name of the formations he commanded, the men who had served under him came to see him buried. The other commanders of the Balaton offensive dispersed into the post-war world in ways that reflected the specific fracture of what they had been. Hugo Krass, who commanded the Hitlerjugend at Balaton, was convicted of no war crimes and returned to civilian life in West Germany. Otto Kumm, who had commanded Der Führer Regiment at Rzeszów and was commanding the Leibstandarte at Balaton, lived until 2004. Wilhelm Bittrich, who commanded the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, settled in West Germany and died in 1979. Karl Ulrich, whose decision to ignore Hitler's hold-at-all-costs order and pull Wiking out of the encirclement at Balaton saved several thousand men from Soviet captivity, emigrated to South America. The men these commanders had led, the Panzer Grenadiers who had paddled across the Sió in rubber boats, the tank commanders who had joked about steering submarines through the Hungarian mud, the artillerymen on both sides who had fired their guns until the barrels were hot enough to cook on, went home or went to prison, or disappeared into the specific anonymity that the end of a total war produces when the side that was wrong about nearly everything loses. The Nagykanizsa oilfields that Hitler had sacrificed the last armoured striking force of the Waffen-SS to protect fell to Soviet forces in late March 1945. The oil that the offensive was meant to secure ran out anyway. The wonder weapons did not arrive. The Anglo-American alliance did not fracture. The war ended on May 8th in the specific way it had been going to end since at least Stalingrad, and the 10 days of fighting at Lake Balaton changed the date of nothing except the deaths of the men who fought there. The Leibstandarte itself had started the war as a parade unit of 117 men, Hitler's personal guard whose primary function in 1933 was standing at attention outside the Reich Chancellery. By May 1945 it had fought in Poland, France, the Balkans, the Soviet Union, Africa, Normandy, Belgium and Hungary, had accumulated more Knights' Crosses than most divisions in the Wehrmacht, had been involved in some of the worst atrocities of the entire conflict, and had ended up in a sequence of events that is the specific tragedy of institutions built on loyalty to a single man. It outlasted its purpose by long enough to be destroyed by it. What did the Battle of Lake Balaton achieve? Nothing. The Nagykanizsa oil fields were lost within weeks regardless. The formations destroyed at Balaton were the ones that might have extended the defence of Vienna or provided a more coherent rearguard in Austria. The oil that the offensive was meant to protect ran out anyway. The war ended on May 8th, without the wonder weapons, without the fracturing of the Anglo-American alliance, without the reversal of fortune that Hitler had been promising his commanders since 1943. What the battle demonstrated, in a way that Kursk did not, because Kursk still had the appearance of a genuine military gamble, was the final dissolution of any connection between Hitler's strategic thinking and military reality. At Kursk, the Germans were attempting something difficult, but not impossible. They were attacking a heavily prepared position with the strongest armoured force available to them, and while the defences proved unbreakable, the attempt was at least a coherent military idea. At Balaton, German commanders had told Hitler the terrain was unsuitable. They had told him the ground was wrong for armour. They had told him the Soviet defences were too strong. They had requested postponement, not cancellation. Hitler refused postponement, and the offensive went ahead in mud that consumed 15 Tiger IIs by swallowing them, in conditions that the chief operations officer had described before the first shot was fired as making a Panzer attack out of the question. The mud of Balaton is the specific image that should be remembered from this battle, not the burning tanks, not the artillery exchanges, not the rubber boats crossing the Sio under machine gun fire, though all of those things happened and all of them cost lives that cannot be restored. The image is the Tiger IIs up to their turrets in the mud of a Hungarian field, their commanders standing in the hatches making jokes about submarines, the men who built them and drove them and died defending them becoming a metaphor for the entire German war effort in its final weeks. The war machine that had conquered Poland in 6 weeks and France in 6 more, that had driven 800 kilometers into the Soviet Union in 6 months, was sinking into the ground, not defeated, not destroyed, sinking, being consumed by the earth of a country it had tried to hold and was losing, in a battle it had been told not to fight, for oil that was not going to save anything. Guderian, who had opposed it from the beginning, gave it its obituary in the same sentence he gave everything else about the final phase of the Eastern Front. There was, he wrote, no longer anything to rely on. The high combat morale that had made these formations what they were, that had kept them fighting through conditions that would have broken other armies, had been spent in the mud between 2 Hungarian lakes in March 1945 and was gone. What replaced it was not surrender, not collapse, but the specific mechanical persistence of men who have nothing left to believe in, but are too trained to stop moving until someone tells them the war is over. The 6th SS Panzer Army that surrendered in Austria in May 1945 was not the 6th SS Panzer Army that had attacked at Balaton in March. The formations had the same names, the same divisional designations, some of the same men, but the thing that had made them what they were, the conviction that they could accomplish what they were ordered to accomplish, that their quality could overcome the arithmetic of the situation, was buried in the mud with the Tiger IIs. What was left was capable of fighting. It was not capable of believing. Lake Balaton is the answer to a question that the history of the Eastern Front poses but rarely answers directly. What does it look like when an army is not defeated but simply used up? Kursk was a defeat. Balaton was the bill coming due. 15 months after Prokhorovka, the same formations were back in the same kind of position, attacking a deeply prepared Soviet defense with insufficient force, and this time the ground itself refused to let them fight. The steel graveyard of Balaton is the graveyard of something more than tanks. It is where the last version of what the Waffen-SS had been in its prime, capable, committed, lethal, went into the mud and did not come back out. And there is one more detail that belongs at the end of this story. When the Soviet collection teams swept through the battle area after the German retreat, they photographed and catalogued every piece of abandoned German equipment. The photographs are still in Russian archives. They show a landscape that looks like something that has never been fully described in any account of the Second World War. A field full of German tanks and vehicles stretching to the horizon, none of them burning, none of them destroyed, most of them sitting at odd angles where they sank or slid off roads or drove into drainage ditches. Some have their hatches open. Some are sitting on solid ground where they could have been driven away if there had been fuel in them. The mud, by the time the Soviet photographers arrived, had dried slightly, enough to show the vehicle tracks, the deep ruts that mark where they came in and the absence of tracks going out. This is what the last major German offensive of the Second World War left behind. Not a battlefield, but a parking lot of the finest armoured vehicles Germany had built, distributed across the Hungarian plain by the specific combination of Hitler's strategic fantasy, the Spring Thaw, and 7 layers of Soviet defence that had been built with the express purpose of absorbing everything these formations had. The men who drove those vehicles and the men who had tried to stop them both went home eventually. The ones who survived. The machines stayed. They were processed for scrap metal in the years after the war. The Hungarian plain was farmed again. The fields that had been a graveyard grew wheat, and the wheat was harvested, and the villages were rebuilt, and the canals that had channeled the German advance were maintained for their original purpose of draining agricultural land. Lake Balaton became a tourist destination. The ground kept its secrets, which is what ground does. Everyone knows Kursk. Not enough people know Balaton. They should.